very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Welcome back to JLF London 2020 at the British Library, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patrons, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We would love for you to consider donating to help us out with JLF London at the British Library by clicking on the donation link below. Our next session for the day is The Devil's Advocate, Karan Thapar in conversation with Georgina Godwin. Karan Thapar, ace Indian journalist, television commentator, and interviewer, began his career in London, where he worked on a varied set of programs. In conversation with fellow journalist and broadcaster Georgina Godwin, he reflects on the changing landscapes of news and views across India and South Asia as he interprets controversies and disruptions and shares memories and learning. Karan Thapar trained as a correspondent, producer, editor, and presenter in the United Kingdom. Thapar has presented the BBC series Hard Talk India, modeled on the lines of the BBC's long-standing program. His other accolades include numerous Asian Television Awards, the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award, the International Press Institute, India Award for Excellence in Journalism in 2013, and more recently, the 2017 G.K. Reddy Memorial Award for Excellence in Journalism. It's taken us many years to persuade Karan to come on to the show. We promised to have him in flesh and blood in London, but unfortunately the circumstances have ruled against it. But we hope to be back in flesh next year in 2021. Georgina Godwin is a broadcast journalist and is a book editor for Monocle 24 and a regular host of current affair programs and cultural shows for various media outlets. To remember, our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions by typing it into the comment sections below, and Georgina will ask these off Karan at the end of the show. Ladies and gentlemen, Devil's Advocate Karan Thapar in conversation with Georgina Godwin. Georgina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. And what a deep and wonderful privilege it is to speak to you, Karan. I'm really happy to connect with a journalist, a legendary journalist such as yourself. This is such a deeply personal book, and it tells your own story alongside the modern history of your country. It begins right from your early years, where you were an unexpected son to a delighted family. Tell me about that early time.
Well, I think my parents had probably forgotten that they were going to have a child because Mummy thought she had liver trouble. And it wasn't till the 7th month of her pregnancy that a visiting Hungarian doctor, I think his name was St. Petri, if I've been told correctly, looked at her and said, "No, you haven't got liver trouble, Mrs. Harper. You're pregnant, 7 months pregnant." And she was deeply embarrassed because she was by then a lieutenant general's wife. And she said, "This is dreadful. Captain and major's wives who are much, much younger are having babies, and now I've joined the lot." So I don't think they expected me. I think it was a moment of wickedness that led to an unexpected result.
You were deeply, deeply loved, though, particularly by your father, who had such a soft spot for you. And I know it was really difficult for him when he sent you off to boarding school. But for you, one of the delights of boarding school was meeting the young Vikram Seth, who taught you some very useful lessons.
He did indeed. He taught me in particular how to speak in public, but it was a very structured, mannered sort of lesson that he gave me. He would sit cross-legged on an old school wooden chair, much like the Buddha in Seance, and he'd say to me, "Now learn up and repeat by heart the speech you're going to make tomorrow." And every time I'd begin, he said, "No, not as loud as that." And then I'd drop my voice and begin again. He said, "No, not as soft as that." And I'd look at him and I'd do it as hurt. And he said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, you'll never learn." But somehow his dismay and his pessimism worked, because I did learn a little bit about debating and managed to help the house team win the school award.
Well, and it stood you in excellent stead because, of course, then you went on to Stowe in England and ended up at Cambridge. And you were the president of the Cambridge Union, so you chaired many, many debates. And it brought you into contact with Benazir Bhutto. Tell us about your relationship with her.
Well, it actually began not when I was president of the union, but a term before that. I was vice president at the time, and Benazir was the treasurer of the Oxford Union, which is what they call their vice president. And she'd come to to Cambridge, to propose the motion, "This house would have sex before marriage." Now, as she was speaking, I noticed that there was a bell that always dangled on the left-hand side of the president's chair, and it was strictly only for the president to use. But a moment of mischief overtook me, and I got carried away, and I leant out, grabbed the bell and buzzed it. And everyone in the house kept silent. Benazir stopped speaking. She turned around and she looked at me, and I said, "Madam, I see you're proposing sex before marriage. Would you care to practice what you preach?" And there was an enormous round of applause, because this is exactly the sort of sophomore schoolboy humor that union students loved. And she very cleverly waited for the humor and the laughter to die down, turned around, whipped off her glasses, screwed up her nose and said, "Certainly, but not with you." And she got an even bigger round of applause.
Fantastic. And I know that you had an enduring relationship with her. And in fact, in later life, after she became Prime Minister of Pakistan, you interviewed her. How do you think being friends with the subject changes an interview?
It's a very tricky, awkward, difficult interview to do. And actually, on reflection, I would say you should never interview people, particularly politicians, who you are trying to show up or push into a corner, if you are also their friends. And this would always be a problem with Benazir, but she was a very sensible, mature person. And every time we'd finish a fractious interview, and they were all fractious, they were all awkward and difficult, she'd say to me, let's have some ice cream and let yourself cool down. Otherwise, we'll never be friends. So she'd always keep a jar of or a packet of Ben and Jerry in the fridge. And I'd attack the wretched thing with her. And we'd always end up friends. But there was no doubt that each interview made it a bit more difficult to get back quickly to being friendly, because obviously she was prime minister. There were things she didn't want to say. I was a journalist. I saw this as an opportunity, particularly when I was in India, to push a Pakistani prime minister, because you know the background of rivalry between the two countries. And therefore it was always tense, difficult, awkward. At times it was actually gladiatorial, but she was mature and sensible and wise. And this advice, let's have ice cream and cool down before you go, was a very sensible decision on her part.
Now, another person that you were really friendly with was Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, or Burma, as she likes to call it. You were in a really unique position, really, watching how her beliefs have changed over the years. I mean, you went from babysitting her small children when you were in Cambridge to speaking to her when she was the leader of the country and watching her attitude towards the Rohingya, for instance, change. Why do you think that she did almost an abrupt 360 pivot?
It's very hard to answer that question because it's one that I've agonized over and I don't think I have an answer to. It's a bit facile and easy to say that it was an opportunistic decision that she took because it ensured that she stayed in power or it brought her to power, because I don't think her values were so fluid that she'd throw them away so easily. On the other hand, it goes against the grain of everything she stood for and did. I mean, just to give you a small example, in the days when I was at Oxford doing a PhD and she and Michael were living in Parktown, I would frequently go across and babysit little Kim and Alexander because Michael and Sue were going to the movies. And there was a particular occasion when we were bantering after they'd come back from the movies, and I referred to Chinese people as chinks. And she looked at me, she said, not chinks, Karan. You don't call them chinks. And years later, when her attitude to the Rohingyas was so uncharacteristic of her, I said to myself, that's attitude that she had, that's behavior when I called Chinese people chinks, is so different to the way she seems to have accepted the Rohingyas as second-class citizens, someone that the Burmese can trample over, someone that their soldiers can rape and kill, and she disregard. So it was completely out of character. It's not the Sue I remember, but sadly, this problem has continued and grown for the last 5-6 years. And it does begin to feel that somewhere down the line, she has become a different person, or she's adopted a different attitude, or her stand on human rights and propriety and etiquette has changed. I don't think I have an answer to your question.
You stayed in Britain after university. In fact, you didn't finish your doctorate. You went and did a spell at the Times. You were a foreign correspondent in Nigeria and then a newspaper journalist for them. And then you ended up working for London Weekend Television. At that time, it was run by John Burt. He had some really interesting lessons on journalism to impart.
He did indeed. He firmly believed that there were two types of interviews, and every interviewer needed to be certain which type he was engaged in. There was the news interview, where your object was to find out what had happened, what someone would do, and it was a straight 3-4 minute set of obvious, straightforward questions that you needed to ask. But then there was the other interview that he would call the current affairs interview, where you were grappling with the situation and either interpreting it or attempting to analyze it, or sometimes to get the person concerned to tell you things about his position and policy which he or she had not revealed. And he said the second sort of interview, the current affairs interview, was best done when you could position your guest as someone who was caught between the two horns of a dilemma. And he said the object was to try and push them either to one end or the other. And he said, in doing so, you must remember that there are only fundamentally 4 answers in the world. Yes, no, don't know, and won't tell. And he said, your job is to collapse the won't knows and the don't tells into yeses and nos. And he said, in a current affairs interview, plan what your strategy is, think of your questions, more importantly, think of what are the likely answers you'll get. And then for each of those likely answers, work out how you'll go further so that you keep coming back to where you want to go and don't get deflected by your interviewee into where he or she wants to take you. And this was an attitude, a strategy, a way of thinking of interviews that was completely new and novel to me. At the time, I must have been 28, 29. I thought interviews were simply a matter of asking questions. I hadn't analyzed and thought about them in the way John had explained them. I certainly hadn't ever for a moment considered that answers can be categorized as just 4 basic types, and that you can collapse the don't knows and won't tells into yeses and nos if you pursue them sensibly, which means strategically. And that was an eye-opening moment, not just for me, but for everyone at LWT. He shaped London Weekend Television's current affairs department. And I think the prime program that we made, Weekend World, which was first presented by Peter Jay, then by Brian Walden, and finally by Matthew Paris, I think it became not just the hallmark of ITV, but arguably, in a very cerebral, theoretical sense, the best current affairs program British television has produced. Very different to programs like Weekend World or The World This Week or Tuesday's Interview. Those were BBC programs that spent a lot of time and emphasis on the footage, the value and quality of what you were seeing. John didn't care about the footage. For him, footage was wallpaper behind someone speaking. What he cared about was the theoretical linear logic of what was being discussed. As a result of which, when Weekend World was broadcast at what everyone thought was a dead television time of 12 noon on a Sunday when no one's watching, every journalist in the country would be glued to their screens because, as you know, Sundays are dead days for news. And what they would glean from the show, in particular from the interview, which was always with a top politician who was the center figure of the top story of that moment, and that would become the front page main story on every British paper on Monday morning. And literally, week after week, for the 10, 11, 12 years that Weekend World ran, this would be the outcome. So it was a highly successful program in terms of its reputation and the way people talked of it. But it was also at the same time, and this sounds a bit paradoxical, not widely known, certainly not widely viewed, and considered by many to be forbidding. And that combination actually helped it. It didn't deter from its reputation.
Then you returned to India after the sad death of your wife, and I would encourage everyone to read the book to experience for themselves the way that you deal with this, and also the really intimate details that you share with us about that relationship. Details that sadly we don't have time to go into here, but with the rest of some highly personal observations, make this an utterly compelling book. When you were once settled back home, you started Eyewitness, which was a huge program of its time. And in the course of your career, you've conducted some highly memorable interviews. One of them was with the legendary cricketer Kapil Dev. Tell us about that.
It was done for a BBC program that I was doing at the time, not for Eyewitness. And the BBC program was meant to be Hard Talk India. That is the program that I approached Kapil for. And he said to me, look, I'm happy to do an interview, but can we do it about a particular problem I face? I'm being accused of having tried to pay 25 lakhs, that's roughly 250,000, to buy a cricket match. It's untrue, but I'd like you to question me as strongly as you can so I can tell the truth and exonerate myself. I said, sure, we'd love to do it. So the interview began. And for the first 10 minutes, he was dry-eyed, perfectly in control of himself. He'd bat away every ball that I threw at him perfectly successfully. And somewhere 10 minutes into what was a 25-minute interview, I said to him, does it worry you that one day history will remember Kapil Dev not just as the captain who won the World Cup for India, which he had, not just as the world's highest taking wicket bowler, which he was, but they'll also remember you as the man who bribed to win a match. And something inside him just snapped. His head went backwards, his eyes flooded with tears, his voice broke, his nose rang, and he bawled like a baby, absolutely howled. And as I saw this happening, I have to be honest with you, although in retrospect, I suppose I'm a little embarrassed by my attitude as well, but let me be honest. I said to myself, this is incredible. Here is a grown man bawling. And I remember people in television in my LWT days saying, there are two things on TV that are magic. Little babies laughing and elderly people crying. And here was the Indian cricket captain bawling. His eyes were red, his nose was streaming, his voice was breaking, and he kept rubbing his nose because it was dripping. And I said to myself, I've got 15 minutes more, and it will be a disaster if he stops crying. How do I get him to continue crying? And yet, I can't make a bore out of myself. I mean, the audience will hate me if it's so obvious that I'm simply stoking the fire. So I dropped my voice so that it sounded as soft, as gentle as I can make it. By the way, I have a raucous voice, so that's a pretty difficult thing for me to do. But at the same time, I kept my questions as sharp and piercing as I could. And Kapil cried for the next 15 minutes. And it was an amazing experience for me. I was a lot younger at the time. This happened in 2000. So it was literally 20 years ago. But you know, the funny thing is, when it ended, I'm not saying his tears were insincere. They weren't. He felt very deeply the awful tragedy of, that's the wrong word, the awful dilemma that he was in. He believed he was innocent and that he was accused of being corrupt and he didn't know how to defend himself. But when it ended, I reached out and shook his hand, and the lights had gone off, and I said, come and have a cup of coffee. And he stayed on for half an hour having coffee and biscuits. And he recovered very quickly, but you could see that he was a man who was deeply upset, because at the end of the day, I think he knew, other than asking people to believe him, there was no way he could prove his innocence. And that becomes galling, because he was convinced he was innocent, but there was no evidence he could put on the table.
Now, obviously, you've done so many high-profile interviews, but a couple I just want to talk about, because you found the same thing, really, that came out about both of them, which is that they were very different from their public personas. And I'm talking here about Amal Clooney and Barack Obama.
Amal Clooney was an enormous disappointment, and I shan't be mealy-mouthed about saying so. I was extremely keen to interview her when she came. She'd come not for a television interview, but for one of those television conferences and conclaves that Indian channels love to hold. The one that I was making programs for at the time was India Today. They'd invited her. I think they paid her, reportedly, $200,000 to come. They'd flown her out and they put her up for a couple of days. And there were 1,000 people in the room. And the channels thought that she had agreed that the interview that would be done could also be broadcast by the channel, so that not just the 1,000 invited guests, but the vast audience beyond at home could actually see and hear Amal Clooney. But somewhere in the narrow print of her contract, she had put in a clause which said that broadcast of the interview could only happen, A, with her permission, and B, she had the right to edit as she wanted. So live broadcast was not permitted. She held back for a good 24 hours before she gave permission, and eventually she cleared 4 minutes of a 40-minute discussion. And I said to myself, here is perhaps the world's most highly recognized, certainly the best known human rights, civil rights lawyer, and yet she's imposing censorship on a channel that has paid her a cold fortune to come to India to do an interview. And there was nothing at all that should have embarrassed her. We talked in glowing terms about the cases she'd fought and won. We talked a little about George Clooney. I know she didn't want to talk about George Clooney, but if you've got George Clooney's wife sitting in front of you, it's pretty difficult not to ask her what sort of husband he is. But I did it smilingly and jokingly. I didn't probe. I certainly wasn't nasty. I accepted whatever she said. And it was only roughly 3 minutes out of the 40 minutes altogether. And she, I think, held herself with great aplomb, with great humor. She told us a lovely set of stories about George Clooney, but she wouldn't let it be broadcast. And I was deeply disappointed. I think, although I ought not to speak on behalf of the channel, but I think they were deeply upset and disappointed. When it comes to Barack Obama, it wasn't dissimilar, to be honest. I mean, here's a man that I admired, thought hugely of. And when I discovered that he was coming to India, this time for a newspaper's conclave, not a television channel, the Hindustan Times had invited him. And because it was a paper that I had first worked with when I was making Eyewitness, their chairperson invited me to conduct that discussion. And this went live because they had brought in a channel partner to broadcast it. There were about 2,000 people in the hall hearing it. But Obama had asked in advance, 15 days in advance, for the questions, which I thought was a bit unusual, but since he was a guest at a newspaper conclave and I didn't want him to back out, and the newspaper said, just send the question, surely he's not going to object to anything. So I did. And I got back a message from Obama's people to say that questions A, B, C, and D are not acceptable. So I said, why on earth are they not acceptable? Oh, because they're a bit touchy and sensitive. I said, but they are precisely to do with issues connected with India. They are of greater interest to an Indian audience than anything else that he'll talk about. So I said to the Hindustan Times that I am going to go ahead and ask those questions, regardless of what Obama says. What is he going to do? Get up and walk out? Or refuse to answer? Or get angry and say, but I told you not to ask those questions? So I did. And they weren't objectionable questions. I mean, one of them was to say to him, as I think probably every one of the 2,000 people in the audience would have been saying to themselves, that you, when you were president, considered India a close fraternal ally. Your predecessor did, your successor does. And yet every member in the audience here believes that when it comes to a choice between the terror India faces from Afghanistan and the terror America faces from Afghanistan, your attitude to our terror is very different to your attitude to theirs. How do you explain that? Because this is a discordant note that everyone will recall and remember. Now, why on earth is that not a question I should ask a former American president? And it refers to the 8 years that he was president. It refers to his policies, but he didn't want it asked. And another question he didn't want asked was right at the end. It was a throwaway question. It was intended to leave the audience with a smile at the end of 40 minutes of a chat. And it was to say to him, President Obama, today America is famous for two Donalds, Donald Duck and Donald Trump. Which is more representative of the country? Now, I just thought that was a humorous, jokey, fun question. But he didn't want that asked either. Anyway, I asked both of those. He was good enough to answer, but he answered at extensive length, making it perfectly clear that instead of answering the question, he was going off on a tangent of his own. And I think a fair number of people in the audience realize that, but he's a man of whom you are awestruck from the word go. And even when he waffles, even when he doesn't speak on the subject, he is engaging and enchanting and riveting. So as far as the audience was concerned, what I thought were non-answers were gripping for them.
Yeah.
So I was disappointed, but I don't think a single member in the audience was.
Of course, there was one person who did walk out of an interview, and that's your current leader, Narendra Modi.
Yes, indeed. That happened, if I recall correctly, 13 years ago, or it will be 13 in October this year. He was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and he was standing for his second re-election. And this was roughly 5 years since the 2001 Godhra, Gujarat killing. So I said to myself, there's no way you can interview him at the brink of a second election without bringing up Godhra and Gujarat. But equally, because he's been Chief Minister for 5 years, there are a lot of other issues that you need to talk about as well. So Godhra and Gujarat can't hijack the interview. And then the question was, at what point do I bring up this very awkward subject that will clearly put him off his stride? I can either do it at the start and get it over with, but that might ruin his mood for the remaining 25 minutes. Or I can do it somewhere in the middle. But if I leave it to the middle or the end, he'll keep asking himself the question, when's it going to come up? When's it going to come up? And that'll make him defensive. So I decided the honest thing to do was to bring it up at the start, discuss it for 2 minutes, get it out of the way, and carry on for the remaining 23 with other issues that are as important. And my first question was, I suppose, a deliberately constructed question. There's no doubt about that. But it's the wording that I think upset him. I said to him, Mr. Modi, you are considered by the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, that is Sonia Gandhi's late husband's foundation, as the best chief minister in the country. India Today magazine has also said you're the best chief minister in the country. But in the eyes of 140 million Muslims, you're viewed as a mass murderer. 6 weeks before an election, do you have an image problem? And I thought very hard about that phrase, mass murderer. I knew it would be provocative. I knew it would offend and annoy him. But I said to myself, that is precisely the language Muslims use when they talk about him. Now, if I use a euphemism in its place, I am not conveying to him either the strength of feeling that Muslims have towards him or the sort of language they use. And the audience that hears the interview will know that, whether they're Muslim or not. So I said, let's be honest, let him hear for the first time the language Muslims use. It may be hurtful, it may be provocative, but it's the truth. And a politician must face the truth. So I used that phrase, and he said to me that this was only the way people like Karan Thapar thought, not others. So I pursued the point a little further, and I said, it's not just Karan Thapar. The Chief Justice of India in open court has called you a modern-day Nero who deliberately looks the other way as innocent women and helpless children burned to death. And he said, find that in writing and I'll answer the question. I said, it wasn't in writing. It was what lawyers call obiter dicta, but does it matter? It was said in open court by the Chief Justice of the country, picked up by every newspaper and television channel. Does it not worry you that the Chief Justice thinks of you or speaks of you in these terms? And he didn't want to answer. And we carried on in this way for about another minute. By then, I think 2.5 or 3 minutes had passed. And he said, I want water. So I said, there's a glass of water beside you, help yourself. But he instead took off his mic, and I realized I want water is an excuse to end the interview. And he did. I mean, he was extremely polite thereafter. He kept me at his home for a whole hour, offering me tea and biscuits and Gujarati sweetmeats. But he was determined not to do the interview. I tried very, very hard to persuade him. I said to him that I would be happy to redo the interview and to move these awkward questions to the end or the middle if that would make it easier, because the questions are not the main part of the interview. But that didn't seem to appease him. I then said to him, look, if you leave me with just 3 minutes, it will become a news item. And the channel will run it in every news bulletin tomorrow. And that means it will be shown 36 times in a day. Whereas if you do the interview, it will be shown once and repeated once and forgotten thereafter. But none of that persuaded him. At the end of the hour, I said, look, I'm terribly sorry. I have to leave. I've got a plane back to Delhi. And he said to me, I'll ring you tomorrow. So tomorrow, after the interview had been broadcast, he phoned in the afternoon and he said to me in a Hindi phrase, he said, you're firing off my shoulder. So I said, I told you this is what the channel will do. And he said, well, don't worry. Brother, he called me. I love you, he said, his precise words. When I come to Delhi, we'll have lunch together. Well, he's been in Delhi for the last 6 years, but we've never had lunch.
And I mean, basically, you're being sidelined by the BJP. I mean, nobody will talk to you.
Absolutely, completely boycotted. Several BJP ministers, Prakash Javadekar, the present Information and Broadcasting Minister, Arun Jaitley, the late Finance Minister, Ram Madhav, the General Secretary of the party, and several other spokesmen have all said to me openly that we have been told not to give you interviews. In fact, Prakash Javadekar rang me up and said, why is my party boss, by whom he meant not Modi, because by then Modi was Prime Minister, but Amit Shah, who's today Home Minister, but at the time was the party president, why have we been told not to give you interviews, not to appear on your shows? Why is he angry with you? And I said, look, I honestly don't know, because for the first 3 years of the Modi government, this issue that happened in 2007 wasn't a problem. But after Modi became confident and after Modi realized that one way of handling the press is not to censor them and edit them, but to simply boycott them, it has the same result without any of the censorious overtones of censoring. That's precisely what he's been doing. And that's what's been the situation for the last 2-3 years.
Now, in a session on Friday, I asked Ambassador Patnaik of the Indian Council of Cultural Relations if there was censorship or even self-censorship in the Indian media. He said, if anything, he felt that the press needed more regulation. And I just wonder how you believe the landscape of news has changed in India, particularly under Modi.
Can I begin by saying that I'm absolutely appalled that Ambassador Patnaik, whoever Ambassador Patnaik may be, forgive me, I'm not aware of this worthy gentleman, but I'm appalled that any official Indian ambassador should say that the Indian press needs more regulation. That I presume
I think he just meant as far as tabloids and that sort of thing was concerned, red top journalism, perhaps. But
we don't have too many tabloids in India, unfortunately, Georgina. There was one that I think ceased to exist because of COVID 4 or 5 months ago. I haven't come across another. There were a few in the 50s and 60s, and they disappeared 3-4 decades ago. No, I think, forgive me, I think what Ambassador Patnaik is reflecting is the unease, the discomfort that the regime of today feels with an open, critical, objective media, which is why many, not all, but many television channels today have anchors who believe and look upon themselves not as guard dogs and watchdogs of freedom, independence, democratic rights, but as lapdogs who want to be liked by the government. And what happens when these wonderful anchors interview the Prime Minister on the odd occasion that he agrees to an interview is, instead of questioning him about lapses that have happened during his term of office, they question him about things the opposition have said, which they know he disagrees with, thus giving him an opportunity to criticize his opponents. Secondly, he's allowed to speak at enormous length. Each answer can go on for 5 minutes, and it frequently rambles. No one makes any effort to bring him back on track, leave aside, interrupt him. And each question is different to the preceding one, so there's no cross-questioning. As a result of which, it feels not like an interview, but an opportunity to the Prime Minister to say what he wants on subjects that perhaps he's even chosen. And there are even accounts that suggest that, in some cases at least, maybe these are apocryphal accounts, interviews have been granted to channels after anchors were told what to ask and after perhaps even the questions were vetted. So we have a fairly sorry situation today in India. Many, I emphasize not all, but many channels have begun to become lapdogs of the government. Many anchors have become important because they're close to the Home Minister or the Prime Minister and preen on that. And one or two or more newspapers are going down that road as well. What happens is newspapers balance opinion pieces or analytical pieces or leaders that are critical of the government by inviting members of the government to write on the same subject on the opposite page. And so you find that people like Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, the present vice president, and before that he was a minister in Mr. Modi's first government, have become leading opinion page writers. And you're amazed. You say to yourself, suddenly the last 4 days, these guys have acquired a second career. I had no idea that this man could write 3 articles a week, but he does.
Yeah. We're going to go to audience questions now, and unfortunately we're really running out of time. There's so much I want to discuss. We're going to have another conversation at some point. I just want to start with a question which has actually come in advance from a Canadian Indian. He says, how has Wahhabism financed the divide, and what's the view from a Muslim-dominated neighborhood? What have terror attacks in the country and the rise of ISIS got to do with the perception of an ordinary Muslim person? And it seems to me that those are not questions that are being asked within the Indian media.
Well, I'm not sure how Wahhabism plays a direct, large and obvious role in subverting Indian politics. It's the sort of thing that people on the right allege. I underline the word allege, but I've seen very little substantive proof of it. Yes, there are an increasing amount of donations or other financial remittances that come in from Saudi Arabia for certain particularly fundamentalist mosques or Muslim groups. But equally, the opposite is true. There are donations that come from Canada and America for some of the more hardline fundamentalist Hindu groups. And governments do attempt to control and regulate and perhaps deny permission for such donations to go through, rightly so, because they exacerbate the situation. But from what I read, the present government is much more concerned about Islamic fundamentalist donations to Muslim organizations than the opposite, which is Hindu fundamentalist donations to Hindu organizations. But beyond that, to claim that there's a large and growing Wahhabist influence in the country is a huge exaggeration. Yes, a few more Indian Muslims have been attracted to Islamic State or to other Islamic terrorist organizations. We can't any longer claim, as we did 6-7 years ago, that not a single Indian has been drawn to these. But the number is very, very small. Remember, we have a Muslim population of over 170 million Muslims. We are the second or the third biggest Muslim population in the world, Indonesia and Pakistan being the first and the second. And it is untrue to say that the vast majority of Indian Muslims are fundamentalist, narrow-minded. They are deeply observant of their religion, as are Hindus, deeply caring of their families, as are Hindus, very conservative and traditional, as are Hindus, and very keen to get on with their fellow citizens, fellow brothers, to live in amity and friendship, as are Hindus. It's a very narrow, perverted view to suggest that Indian Muslims are becoming hugely influenced by Wahhabist influence. A small element, yes, maybe, but to say that that is true of Indian Muslims in the majority is just simply not true.
Mm-hmm. A question now, this is from, I think it's Sachdev Ramesh Krishna, who says, was there an interviewee where you may have been outwitted? Rare for someone as prepared and thought through like you.
Oh, several. There are many interviewees who've had the better of me. One of them who did it 2 or 3 times was the former Deputy Prime Minister of India. He was also at the time President of the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Modi's party, Lal Krishna Advani. There were interviews with him that were fractious, interviews with him where he got very upset. I recall one done in 1998 before the BJP came to power for the first time. Mr. Advani was president of the party and he was leading the campaign that would win the elections roughly in 6 weeks' time. And in an interview with him, I said to him, you have torn off the monster's face and replaced it with an endearing smile. And I was clearly saying that you've changed the image of the BJP. No longer are you the fierce monster we saw you as, you're now an engaging entity. Anyway, he smiled, he answered it. During the commercial break, he got up and he left the room. So I said, where are you going? He said, well, if you think I'm a monster, why do you want to talk to me? So I said, oh, Mr. Advani, that was just a turn of phrase. And I was terribly scared. I said, the commercial break will end in about 2 minutes' time and he won't be back. 30 seconds later, he walked in, sat down and he looked at the crew and he said, I'm terribly sorry. I behaved very foolishly. I apologize. And, I was stunned. I said, here is a man who went on to become Deputy Prime Minister. And he had no compunction apologizing, no compunction accepting his mistake. A human being who got riled by a phrase I used, which may have been the wrong one. Certainly it was provocative, but he didn't hold it against me. And he went on to give me multiple interviews. And almost every time, he'd get the better of me. So I always look back on those interviews as someone who I admire, a truly admirable person, because he was also a good person. Good because he wasn't so arrogant that he couldn't say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
It's been so wonderful to talk to you, and we just don't have time to take any more questions. I just wanted you to wrap up by telling us what's next, because you've written this wonderful autobiography and Devil's Advocate, and it seems like that was a life that was, but there's surely so much more to come.
I certainly hope so. I'm only 64 at the moment, and I'm determined that there are at least 10 or 15 years, if not more. But I'm not working on any other book at the moment. I spend my time preparing for the interviews that I do, and I do 3 a week for a website called The Wire. They are different to the television interviews in the sense that now we deliberately allow them to carry on for 40, 45 minutes, because I think at a time of crisis, when the economy has collapsed, when COVID is raging, and when we face this pretty unrelenting threat from China in the Himalayan borders, people want understanding rather than soundbite. And so we do deliberate, extensive interviews with people who are knowledgeable and expert in the field to try and find out what's happening. And I've enjoyed them. I've been doing them for about a year and a bit, and I certainly shall continue to do them for a bit more. But will I write another book? Because I suspect that is what is at the back of your question. I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Well, then people should absolutely read this one, in case you never do. It's called Devil's Advocate. It's published by HarperCollins, and it's available now. And it's so lovely, as are you. Thanks so much for speaking to me.
Georgina, can I thank you for all the kind and wonderful and generous things that you said, and in particular for your incredible praise for the book. I do hope people listen to you and believe you. Although you've been so generous, they might just say, she's just being kind. Thank you. Thank you for being such a wonderful host.
I'm going to hand you back to Sanjoy now.
Thank you so much, Georgina Godwin, and thank you so much, Karan Thapar. And Georgina, I was one of the victims that Karan was trying to wrestle to either the no or the yes corner on one particular interview. But hey, much more of that. It's been a brilliant session. We've got some incredible comments that have been flowing in. Thank you, Karan, for making time for this interview. Everybody out there, go and pick up the book. It is absolutely a brilliant biography, an autobiography by Karan. So go out and buy it and read it. Thank you, Georgina, for all your help and for agreeing to do this. Do stay on for our next session. And do remember, we would love you to donate to help us with JLF at British Library. And you may do so by clicking on the link below. And you can also support the British Library by donating on support.bl.uk/donate. Our next session is Jikoni to the Chef's Table, Food and Creativity, Ravindra Bhogal, Asma Khan, and Veer Sanghvi in conversation with Krishnendu Ray. We now also present two Jaipur writer shorts featuring Nitin Goel, followed by Anamika. Thank you.
I first heard about the greatest literary show on earth during my business school days, exactly a decade ago. The mere idea of an annual confluence of readers and writers to celebrate the written word, open to one and all without any entry fees, sounded absolutely brilliant to my broke bibliophilic self. But alas, final placement season was upon us the same last week of January, and scoring a job in a post-recession environment took obvious priority over taking a dip at the Kumbh of literature. Next year, I vowed to myself. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the next year, or the one after that. While I was chasing exorbitant annual revenue targets in exchange for paltry monthly paychecks, 7 editions of JLF whooshed past me. 7 times, a combination of external obligations and internal inertia played spoilsport with my Jaipur plans. But finally, things changed. In August 2017, I succumbed to the proverbial 7-year itch, and as a social experiment, chose to pause my corporate career for an indefinite time period, at the ripe old age of 32. I had no grand plans drawn up for my sabbatical, no notions of finding myself or discovering the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. All I wanted was to check out life, one day at a time, beyond the stereotypical path glorified by society. For a while I still could. Of all that I could have little expected on that fateful day I walked out of office without a plan, the following 3 were the least plausible, in increasing order of implausibility. Number 1, my gap year would be 30 months long and counting. Number 2, my guardian angel would be Harry Potter, conjuring, among other charms, free flight tickets to London. And number 3, my only close shave with death during 300 plus days on the road would be courtesy a suicidal tree fed up with a palatial life in the JLF delegate zone at Diggy Palace. So yes, as I close the curtains on this rather unique phase of my existence on Earth. For my first long-form written piece about it all, it feels symbolic to weave into words my rather unique experience at the Woodstock, Live Aid and Ibiza of world literature. Even more so, as unfortunately this year, unlike the past couple of Januaries, I won't be pulling any strings to land my hands upon a delegate all-access festival pass, or booking myself into the cheapest yet highest rated hostel I could find on booking.com, or hopping upon the Delhi-Jaipur double-decker train for 5 days of insanity. Not because I've developed a morbid fear of trees, but the fact that an official 10-year B-School reunion clashes with JLF 2020. But I can safely say with certitude, I'll be back.
I bleed and I burn in the agony of pain inflicted upon me by these fellow men and women. I bleed and I burn like a Samaritan who is hanged, labeled as a witch for just being different, for being courageous, to talk about the taboos on which they wouldn't open their sealed lips, for standing against the myths they have made a reality of, for the people she fought for, that made people in hierarchy afraid of her wisdom and brave. I bleed and I burn because this is who I am, a woman with a bleeding womb, a phoenix with a raging fire. For I burn those myths, all those stigmas, who have left us women agonized and alone to bear the civilization's honorable weight. I still bleed and I still burn because I'm a woman who refused to break.
Re